Okay, this next tutorial we're going to create our first sign. We're going to use all the techniques that we have explored so far and put them all together into creating a sign composition. Let's start by creating a new project again. 12 by 5.5. Same size as before, we'll just stick with this dimension. And our board shows up here. Click on the blue shell to open our pattern library. And in our basic patterns, let's look at fruits and vegetables and select the grapes. We're going to place the grapes here on the board, scale it down a little bit, and then let's rotate it. So in this composition, instead of creating a symmetrical design, we're going to go for an asymmetric composition. So we're going to work just a little bit differently here. So give it a little bit of an angle, some interest, make sure it's spaced a little from the edge, and we can adjust all this as we continue to go along. Let's grab some vines to put on our grapes here. We can drop this here. You notice how it's showing up behind. Now you can see it poking through a little bit there, but let's rotate that and position it so that they look like they're supposed to be together. And this is all part of the visual nature of Project Designer, where you are designing for what looks good rather than spending a lot of time programming. So we can position all of this here, and I like the way that nests in there, but we have some issues here where the pattern is showing through the stem of that. So we can use some of the adjustment tools to make this go away. So on the last project, when we created the background, we used the height tool to lower that particular background down to shallow it up so it didn't detract so much from the foreground. We're going to do kind of the same thing here, but we're going to use it to create some layering techniques. So when we click on this pattern, we can see that this pattern is at 0.239 depth. Let's click on the grapes, and that's actually at 0.25. So the first step of this is that we want to make sure that each of these patterns is at the same depth and see if that resolves the problem itself. I can still see some elements there. The next step is to then start adjusting the height down to where you can see it disappear. So I push that down to 80. So you can kind of see how I am creating a layering technique through pushing things in front of or behind other items just through these adjustments here, depth and height. And I've set both of these at the same depth now, so they are going to carve down to the same base level. So if I want to put a background on this, I can set it to 1/4 inch, just like the depth of these are, and it's going to look like these are rising right from that depth. And now it looks like this one's actually coming out from behind it. Okay, let's add another pattern to this. Let's find another vine that looks good. It's kind of coming out the other side here. Alright, drop this one on the board. Now this one, stem's sticking over here. We want it to be coming out over there, so we want to rotate this. But we don't really want to rotate it. We want to flip it because we still want this other direction going. So let's right click and go to flip and rotate, and then we're going to flip it horizontally. So just as the little icon described, that's exactly how it flipped for us. Now we can nest this one back in here, maybe give it a little bit of an angle, and let's zoom in on this one. We can see here that the depth of this one is at 0.24, but it does sit pretty nicely behind. Let's go ahead and set it to 0.25 just to make everything a consistent depth. And let's zoom out. So another thing to consider when doing carvings, especially one that's this small, is that 1/4 inch is actually pretty deep for something that's only 5.5 inch by 12 inches and is going to take more time to carve, because every amount of material that's got to be removed is time that the machine is going to take to do so. So on projects this small, I'm actually going to select each of these. So I'm going to click off of the board. I have nothing selected. I'm going to right click on the board and choose select all, and then we're going to go in here and type 0.125 for depth. So this is going to set it all to 1/8 of an inch. So that shallows it up quite a bit, but we've got the issue of the stem showing up in here again, so we're going to need to adjust this down. We're going to keep adjusting it down until we see it go away. So now down at 40, it seems to have disappeared again. Next step, let's add some text to this. Click on the blue T. We're going to click on the board. And for this sign, since it's got grapes and things, let's pick a little more maybe decorative or italic font here. Fine wine. And then I'm going to add some spaces here to wine. And then I'm going to select all of this, and we're going to adjust the line spacing here. I want them a little bit closer together. I can actually type in here, since I want them to closer together, I'll type in negative numbers. Let's go to -10 and see how far that goes. That's pretty good. And then I'm going to make sure that the route mode is selected on raster. Now you can choose any font that you want. This is just one that caught my eye while I was scrolling through here. So choose your own font and make this however you'd like to do so. And then hit OK. And then our text shows up here on the board. Let's make it larger and position it how we want. Okay, so we do see that this background piece here, this vine, is interfering a little bit with the text here, not too much. So we can shallow that up as well. Let's make that sit a little more in the background. I think we used 40 on the other side there, so maybe 40 works here too. I think that'll be pushed back enough to get it a nice amount of subtlety. So there's the basics of our sign, but as we saw in the other project, when we started adding backgrounds to it, it got a lot more interesting. So let's do the same with this one. Let's draw our rectangle to create our background, and then use the Carve Region tool. That's the tool that gives it depth. And since we've changed everything to be 1/8 of an inch, let's change this one to also be 1/8 of an inch deep. Now we've got a consistent depth level. These patterns look like they're rising up out of that. We've got a little bit of interference with the outer edges, so you can see that feather that was on these patterns intersecting with the outside edge of this. And this pattern is probably just sitting up a little bit too high. So let's rotate this and bring it in, and maybe even just scale it down a little bit. And this is, again, part of that design process. While we've got this nice visual editor here that allows us to just see and arrange these things in ways that look good. Okay, so we want to get rid of these little pieces of interference here. So we can do that by selecting our patterns. You can hold down the shift button and select more than one pattern. And then we're going to turn the feather off on these. So we're going to go to our feather tool here, the blue feather. We're going to select feather none. And then that will eliminate that little feathered edge on the outside of these patterns. We don't have any more of this interference. But just as we saw in that first project, we do want to add a feather to this part. So we're going to go ahead and add a feather 1/8 of an inch. And feathers, one thing I didn't cover before, especially when you're doing shapes like this, you can flip that feather to an inside or outside edge depending on what you're needing from your project. The inside edge will give you a sharp corner, and outside edge will actually round that corner slightly, so that's also something to consider when choosing which feather you want. I prefer the sharp edge inside corners. Let's hit accept. We also need to center this background, so let's right click on that and center both. That puts it in the middle. And then let's add a texture to this background just like we did in the other one to give this some visual interest. Click the select texture button and choose one of these, whichever that we decide we like. Let's use this one this time, and we'll just leave the interval as it was. Again, way too busy, so let's reduce that height to make it more shallow. Let's take it all the way down to 20 and see how that looks. That's quite a bit better. And then now we need to do some further optimization. So as in the other project, we want to select all of our patterns, and this is where the carving list can come in handy, where we've got a lot more pieces on the board now. So I'm going to open up that carving list under View, Carving List, and now we can see all of these pieces on the board. So I can select everything by holding down the Shift button. Click on the top one, hold down the Shift button on your keyboard, and then select all of those. And then let's go to Bit Optimization and put it at Best. And remember, this helps so that it doesn't cut into any of the edge details of our carving, and it gives us much finer detail. We've already added a feather to our rectangle here, which is going to help with this outside edge. But if you look at this text has a really bad cliff edge. It's got that straight up and down edge on there. And if you remember from the first tutorial, we talked about with these straight up and down cliff edges, the bit will try to go and get that very bottom edge, and in doing so, because it's a tapered bit, it will chip out this top edge. And especially with text that's this thin, you will end up obliterating almost all the text, and then when you finish your carving, you're going to be very upset because your letters aren't readable and they're all chipped away. So this is where that draft tool, this is kind of very similar to feather, but it's kind of the opposite. So feather goes from the bottom level up to the surface level. Draft is going to go from the top level of the pattern to the bottom level of whatever the depth is of the pattern. So let's go ahead and select draft, and we've got different sizes here. We can look at them all. So we can try small. Small adds a very slight taper. It's usually just enough to accommodate the bit, the taper of the bit, and it will work in most cases where you don't want to necessarily see the draft. Medium gives a little bit more of a beveled edge, which actually starts to take on a decorative quality. And then draft is very extreme and can be a very nice technique, especially on very fine text. You can get this really nice bevel, outside bevel pattern. I prefer on most text, especially at this scale, to use the medium draft because it gives me a nice visual effect, and it's going to carve very solid without any chip out. Okay, click on the F to bring the project to the front, and there is our finished sign, our first sign project. Another thing I like to introduce during this project is under the edit board settings, which we covered a little bit in the very first tutorial. We've got the stain finish option here. It looks a little bit different in basic, but it does mainly the same thing, at least when this part here. So you can select different types of wood from the selector there, and then you can type or choose different finishes. So I can actually put a high gloss finish and choose the type of wood and stain that I'm going to be working with, and then click OK. And then of course I've got to go turn my wood grain back on if I want to see what that wood grain looks like. But then I've got a high gloss finish with the selected wood grain on there. So if I need to show this to a client of what the finished piece is going to look like for a sign I'm making them, I can actually produce a pretty nice rendering that I can also use my print function to print out and send them a copy. Okay, we're going to do some more on signs in the next tutorial. To finish off your sign projects, we can add a slot into the back for picture hanging hooks or a nail on the wall or whatever it is that you're using to mount your sign or plaque. This is going to use the keyhole function. So we've got our sign here. Let's click the R button, which flips our project to the back of the board, and then we can select our keyhole function button and then click on the board. So we're going to put it down here because if you saw the way that it flips like this. So the actual top of the board is now facing down on the back side. So we're going to put the keyhole here, and it's going to give us some options. The 325 depth is just the default depth for that bit. I never change that. That's just the size that it should be. Up is referring to the direction that it's going to slot, and up in this context when you're looking at the back of the board is actually down because the top, remember this is flipped over, so the top of the board and our project is down here. So you want to make it up even when you're working on the back of the board upside down. And then length is just how long is that slot going to be. I usually only make mine a ½ inch, even though 3/4 is the default. 3/4 is just fine. It's whatever you're comfortable with. You can even make it longer. Then I'm going to hit OK. So there's our keyhole slot. It shows up there. I'm going to make sure I space it away from the edge of the board so I don't get too thin there. And then I'm going to center it just on that center axis so that it's right there in the middle and it's locked into place. And that's it. It's going to plunge down here and then slot over and then come back and out so that you've got a slotted hanging bracket basically on the back of your sign or plaque. I can flip back over to the front, and my project is now finished. So when you load this project, it's actually going to ask for this bit first, and it's going to slot this on the back of your project first, and then it'll have you flip the board back over. And it's important to pay attention to how it flips it here in the software, because that's the same way you need to flip it in the machine, on the width direction, not on the length direction. If you flip it that way, then this is going to end up being upside down on your project. So make sure that you flip on the width, and when you flip the project in the machine, and your slot will be in the perfect place, and your project is finished and ready to go, ready to upload. A very important part of designing your projects is saving your projects. So we already have talked about uploading to your memory card, but uploading to your memory card is not saving your project. Your project cannot be pulled back off of your memory card. So when you finish your project, you need to go to Save or Save As, and then give your project a file name that you can easily recognize what your project is, and then click Save. It's important to save your work, because if you don't save it, you're not going to be able to find it again. You're going to have to start over from scratch and remake it.